From the moment we're born, we're told this one thing over and over. Family is everything. It's supposed to be our foundation, right? Our safety net, the one bond that's absolutely unbreakable. But for millions of people, that's just not the reality. So today, we're going to dive deep into the silent epidemic of family estrangement, not as some story of betrayal, but as a really complex psychology of survival.
This question, it really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? See, from the outside, estrangement often looks like this sudden, cold decision. But behind that silence, you rarely find a simple story of anger. Instead, what you usually find is this deep, often agonizing journey to preserve one's own sanity.
So here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to start with the unseen erosion that slowly wears a relationship down. Then we'll look at the assigned roles people are so often forced to play. After that, we'll talk about the empty well of emotional neglect, and finally, we'll explore the path to peace that people have to forge for themselves.
Okay, let's get right into it. Family estrangement almost never starts with some big dramatic explosion. It actually starts with erosion, a process so slow and so quiet it's basically invisible to everyone except the person who's living through it.
And the foundation of this erosion is something psychologists call microtrauma. Now, we're not talking about huge catastrophic events here. We're talking about hundreds of small cuts. The subtle criticism that's disguised as just being concerned, the boundary that gets pushed a little further every single time, or that dismissive tone that just tells you your feelings don't really matter. On their own, they might seem minor, but when you put them all together, they create this psychological climate of just chronic anxiety.
And this is what's so fascinating because it captures what's called the volcano effect. From the outside, the final break looks totally sudden and shocking, like an eruption out of nowhere. But lava doesn't just appear overnight, right? It builds silently for years under the surface. That final argument is never the real cause. It's just the moment all that internal pressure becomes absolutely unbearable. The break only looks sudden because the suffering was silent.
And this, right here, is the key. The true beginning of estrangement isn't really about anger. It's about depletion. It's that moment when a person has just completely run out of energy, out of hope, and out of the capacity to keep absorbing the same wounds over and over and over again.
Now, this sense of being completely drained, it builds over time. And that's often because long before someone chooses distance, they've been cast in a role they never, ever chose. See, in some family systems, you don't really get to discover who you are. Your identity is assigned to you.
And these roles, they can define a child's entire emotional reality. First, you might have the golden child, who has to carry the burden of the family's success story. Or you could have the scapegoat, who gets blamed for all the family's problems, often because they're the only one brave enough to see the truth. Then there's the invisible child, who learns that the only way to be safe is to need nothing from anyone. And the parentified child, who has to become the emotional grown-up for their own parents. So the really crucial point here is that not a single one of these roles allows a person to grow into their true, authentic self.
And what happens is, when someone finally tries to step out of that assigned role, the whole system often fights back with blame and punishment. And for so many, the only way to become a whole person, to actually reclaim themselves, is to walk away from that role entirely. Some wounds are really obvious, but others are defined by what's missing. And this brings us to this really powerful metaphor of the empty well, which helps explain the profound impact of emotional neglect.
Emotional neglect is so quiet. It doesn't leave any bruises. It's the comfort that was never offered when you were hurting, the protection that never came when you were scared, this simple curiosity about your inner world that no one ever showed. It teaches a child a really devastating lesson, that their feelings are either way too much or just not worth noticing at all. You keep going back to that well hoping for water, but every single time, you find it bone dry.
So this begs a really big question, right? If the well is always empty, why do people keep going back for years, sometimes even decades, before they finally step away? Well, the answer lies in two incredibly powerful psychological forces. The first one is called trauma bonding. This is what happens when moments of real harm are mixed in with these little breadcrumbs of warmth. A really cutting remark followed by a rare apology, or a long, cold silence that's suddenly broken by a moment of affection. Your nervous system actually gets conditioned to confuse this intense, chaotic, inconsistent cycle with love. And that leads right into the second force, the hope cycle. This is the belief that keeps you trying and forgiving and waiting for that breakthrough that just never comes. Hope itself becomes the trap.
It convinces you to stay because of who they could be, not who they consistently show you they are. Walking away often only happens when you finally realize that cycle is just never going to break.
So what happens after that realization finally hits? Well, when someone decides they just can't stay anymore, the journey shifts to reclaiming their own life. And this isn't about revenge, it's about survival. Creating that distance usually happens in stages. It might start with something called low contact, cutting down on conversations, keeping topics really superficial. Other people use the gray rock method, where they become deliberately boring and unreactive to avoid fueling those old conflicts. And for some, after every other boundary gets ignored, no contact becomes the only path left to stop the cycle and protect their mental health.
But this distance, it comes with a very specific, very painful kind of grief called ambiguous loss. You're basically mourning someone who is still alive, but is just emotionally unreachable. There's no funeral, there's no closure, just this lingering ache for the relationship you lost, and maybe even more painfully, for the one you never even got to have. But here's the thing. Out of this grief, something new can actually begin to grow. And this slide shows that path forward perfectly. It's the shift from a family of origin, one connected by DNA and obligation, to a family of choice, friends, partners, communities that are built on genuine respect, warmth, and real emotional safety. For so many people, this entire exhausting process is driven by a single powerful resolution. This ends with me. It's a conscious, deliberate decision to not pass on the chaos, the emotional starvation, or the conditional love to the next generation. It's about breaking the cycle, right here, right now.
So you see, healing isn't really about forgetting. It's about being able to hold two things at once: the grief for what you lost and the quiet, fierce determination to build the life you've always deserved. It's about choosing your peace over your history.
And that really leaves us with one last idea to think about. Estrangement isn't just about walking away from something. It's about walking toward yourself. And maybe, just maybe, the bravest thing a person can do is redefine family. Not by who you were born to, but by who finally makes you feel safe enough to be whole.